Deep in Madagascar's eastern rainforests, there are things people still won't say out loud after dark. Not superstitions exactly, warnings. Villagers speak of a shape that moves through the canopy without sound, that can hypnotize a chicken into walking toward its own death, that steals more than livestock when it visits a farm at night. For generations, this animal had no fixed name, no settled identity, only fear. Some called it a spirit, others called it a curse with fur, and for a very long time, the scientists who came looking for it weren't much closer to the truth than the people who'd been avoiding it for centuries. When European naturalists finally began documenting Madagascar's wildlife, they ran straight into a problem this animal seemed to enjoy causing. One expedition described it as a kind of cat. Another insisted it was closer to a civet. A third simply refused to commit, unwilling to file a creature this contradictory under any single label. Picture something roughly the length of a large dog, low and lean, reddish-brown, with the flattened, forward-set face of a cat, and the loose-jointed, elongated body of something else entirely, something that didn't seem to belong to any family tree they recognized. It didn't behave like the predators they knew from the mainland. It didn't move like them either. That confusion wasn't a failure of observation. It was the first clue. Madagascar had been cut off from mainland Africa for roughly 88 million years, drifting alone in the Indian Ocean while its animals evolved in near-total isolation, answering ecological questions with solutions found nowhere else on Earth. Whatever this creature was, it hadn't been shaped by the same pressures, the same competitors, the same evolutionary blueprint as anything familiar. It had been built from scratch, by an island working alone. So the question naturalists left unanswered, the one still sitting at the center of the mystery, was simple, and it would take science more than a century to earn the right to answer it. If this animal wasn't a cat, and wasn't a civet, and didn't fit anywhere obvious on the map of known predators, what exactly was it related to? The answer, when it finally arrived, didn't come from a naturalist's notebook. It came from something the animal couldn't hide from, its own genes. For decades, guesswork had ruled. The FOSSA's cat-like skull and retractable claws seemed to settle the matter for some researchers. Case closed, just an unusual cat. But skeletons can lie, or at least mislead, and this one had been misleading people for 100 years. When geneticists finally sequenced its DNA and compared it against carnivores worldwide, the result overturned everything the resemblance had implied. The fossa wasn't a cat at all. It belonged to a family called Eupleridae, and every member of that family traced back to a single common ancestor, a small, mongoose-like animal that had drifted or rafted onto Madagascar tens of millions of years ago, and then simply never left. That ancestor found itself somewhere unprecedented, an island with ecological jobs waiting to be filled and almost nothing else in line to fill them. On continents, those roles already belonged to established dynasties, true cats, true civets, true weasels, each locked into their niche by millions of years of competition. But Madagascar had no such gatekeepers, so one mongoose-like lineage did something continents rarely allow. It diversified into all of them at once, splitting into forms that hunted like cats, foraged like civets, burrowed like weasels, not because it was related to any of them, but because it was the only option available to nature. The fossa became the most extreme result of that experiment. Faced with an empty apex predator role, this single lineage didn't just adapt to fill it, it transformed almost beyond recognition, reshaping teeth, skull, posture, and gait until it converged, feature by feature, on something that looked uncannily like a small cougar. This is convergent evolution at its most theatrical, unrelated ancestry arriving at a strikingly similar destination because the pressures of hunting large, agile prey tend to demand similar tools, regardless of who's building them. But a mongoose ancestor's body was never designed for what the fossa does now. Mongooses are ground-dwelling generalists, quick, low-slung, built for scrubland and burrows, not for the vertical, branch-to-branch chaos of a rainforest canopy. And yet the fossa hunts 30, 40, sometimes more feet above the forest floor, chasing prey through a three-dimensional maze of moving branches at speed. Somewhere between that ancestor and this animal, evolution had to solve a problem no mongoose lineage anywhere else on Earth ever faced. Which leaves the far stranger question hiding behind the genetic answer. If the fossa's skeleton was inherited from a creature built for the ground, how did it ever learn to move through the trees like it was born there? To understand what makes the fossa dangerous, you have to stop watching it run and start watching it climb, because that's where the impossible becomes visible. A leopard, for all its power, is a hesitant creature in the canopy. It can climb, certainly, drag a kill up a trunk, rest along a thick limb, but descending is another matter. Watch a big cat come down a tree and you'll see caution, a backward, careful retreat, claws testing each foothold, weight held in check by gravity's threat. The fossa doesn't retreat. It descends headfirst, at speed, as though the 90-degree problem simply doesn't apply to it. The reason lies in a joint most predators never had to reinvent: the ankle. In most carnivores, including cats, the ankle is a hinge, efficient for running, useless for hanging upside down. The fossa's ankle rotates nearly a full half circle, a range of motion that lets its hind feet grip a branch from almost any angle, including directly beneath its own body while facing down a vertical trunk. Add semi-retractable claws, not fully sheathed like a cat's, not fully exposed like a dog's, but held in a middle configuration that keeps them permanently ready for traction, and you get an animal that treats bark the way most predators treat flat ground. Then there's the tail. Long, thick at the base, astonishingly flexible, it functions less like a cat's tail and more like a counterweight system borrowed from a primate, constantly adjusting, constantly correcting, turning a leap between unstable branches into a calculated transfer of balance rather than a gamble. Combine that with a spine loose enough to arch and twist through tight canopy gaps, yet powerful enough to launch the animal in explosive ground sprints when the hunt spills downward, and you have a body that refuses to specialize in only one terrain. This is what makes the fossa's design so unusual. It isn't the best climber in Madagascar, and it isn't the fastest runner either. What it is, uniquely, is competent at both, simultaneously, in a way that leaves it no obvious gap to fall through. A monkey could outclimb it. A civet might match its scramble through branches. But nothing else on the island pairs canopy agility with genuine predatory weaponry: the jaws, the claws, the raw intent to kill. The fossa doesn't win by being the best specialist. It wins by occupying a gap that specialists on either side of it can't reach. Which raises an obvious question, and it's not really about the fossa at all. A body this specifically engineered for climbing, chasing, and cornering prey through the treetops doesn't evolve in a vacuum. It evolves because something up there was worth all this trouble to catch. Something fast, something evasive, something that has been running from this animal for a very long time. Madagascar's canopy is crowded in a way few forests on Earth can match, and almost all of that crowding belongs to one family, the lemurs. Cut off from the same isolation that shaped the fossa, lemurs faced no competition from monkeys or apes, no established primate hierarchy to squeeze into. So they did what isolated lineages on this island seem to do best. They radiated outward into every available form. Some grew small enough to fit in a palm, foraging alone under cover of night. Others grew large, loud, and social, moving through the trees in coordinated troops. Between those extremes sits an astonishing range of size, diet, and behavior, all descended from ancestors that arrived on Madagascar with far less variety than what remains today. None of that diversification happened in isolation from the fossa. It happened because of it. For as long as lemurs have filled these branches, something has been hunting them there, and the relationship between predator and prey rarely stays still for long. Every advantage one side gains becomes pressure the other side must answer. Biologists studying lemur behavior have long been struck by how much of it seems shaped by an unseen threat from above the leaf litter and below the canopy's edge simultaneously. The specific alarm calls many species use to distinguish aerial danger from ground danger, the tendency of some troops to post sentries while others feed, the heightened vigilance clustered around dawn and dusk, precisely when a fossa is most active. None of this proves a single cause, but it points toward the same conclusion again and again. A predator, this persistent, doesn't just hunt an ecosystem. Over enough generations, it helps write the rulebook that ecosystem lives by. The fossa, for its part, never became a picky eater, which is part of what makes it so formidable. Lemurs make up a significant share of its diet, but far from all of it. Birds, reptiles, insects, and Madagascar's peculiar spiny tenrecs all end up on the menu when circumstances call for it. This flexibility matters more than it might first appear. A predator locked onto a single prey species lives and dies by that species' fortunes. If the prey vanishes, so does the predator. A predator willing to adapt its diet season by season, forest by forest, survives the lean years that would otherwise starve a specialist out of existence. But flexibility in diet is not the same as flexibility in relationship. Whatever balance evolved between fossa and lemur over these millions of years, it evolved slowly, incrementally, each side calibrated to the other's current best trick. That kind of balance is durable against gradual change. It is far less durable against sudden change, against a predator whose pursuit techniques improve while the prey's defenses stay locked in an older evolutionary rhythm, or against threats neither species has had time to adapt to at all. Which brings the story to the moment the theory becomes reality, not the slow calculus of evolution, but the raw, immediate mechanics of an actual hunt, playing out in real time, with everything both species have spent millions of years preparing for, finally put to the test. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a Malagasy forest just before a fossa hunts, and it isn't the absence of sound, it's the absence of warning. Unlike lions coordinating a pride, or wolves running a pack strategy honed over generations of shared hunts, the fossa hunts alone. There is no backup, no flanking maneuver executed by a second animal, no margin for error borrowed from teammates. Everything the fossa does, it does on its own account, stalking through undergrowth with a low, deliberate gait, pausing at intervals to read the forest, closing distance in silence before committing to the one moment that matters, the burst. That burst is where the fossa stops looking like anything ordinary. Explosive acceleration carries it across open ground or up a trunk in the same fluid motion, and its bite, delivered by a skull built with disproportionate force for an animal its size, is engineered to end an encounter quickly rather than wear an opponent down. But speed and bite force only tell part of the story. What separates the fossa from a merely capable predator is how it uses the terrain itself as a weapon. A fossa hunting a lemur troop doesn't simply chase, it reads the canopy's architecture anticipating which branch a fleeing animal will need next, cutting off the ground route while another lemur scrambles higher, exploiting the fact that Madagascar's canopy, however vast, is not infinite. Every tree eventually runs out of branches. This is how a mid-sized predator manages something that shouldn't be possible on paper, taking down prey considerably larger than itself. Adult siphakas, strong, alert, capable leapers weighing nearly as much as the fossa itself, have fallen to solitary fossas, not because the fossa overpowered them through brute strength, but because it outthought their escape route before the chase even began. Persistence, terrain control, and precise timing accomplish what raw power alone could never manage against prey with a genuine size advantage. It's this combination, the silence, the speed, the eerie tactical intelligence, that likely built the fossa's reputation among people who witnessed its aftermath without ever seeing the animal itself. A farmer waking to a decimated henhouse with no tracks, no sound, no visible predator, doesn't reach for biomechanics as an explanation. They reach for something closer to a demon. Science now understands what those witnesses couldn't, not a supernatural killer, but a predator so specifically adapted to this environment that its efficiency looked, from the outside, like something beyond nature's usual rules. And that raises a question the hunting behavior alone can't answer. An apex predator, this capable, this efficient, facing prey that has had millions of years to develop defenses, should, by every rule of continental ecology, be locked in constant competition with other large predators fighting over the same resources. Lions share their plains with hyenas. Wolves share their forests with bears. Yet on Madagascar, the fossa answers to no one. Nothing challenges it. Nothing competes with it. And the reason why has less to do with the fossa itself than with something missing from this island entirely. Step off Madagascar and onto almost any continent, and the rules of predator society change immediately. In Africa, lions contend with hyenas, leopards, and wild dogs, all competing for the same carcasses, all keeping each other's numbers and behavior in check. In North America, wolves share their range with bears and cougars. Predator diversity, on a continental scale, is the norm. An ecosystem's top tier is rarely occupied by just one tenant. Madagascar broke that rule entirely, and the reason has nothing to do with the fossa's ability and everything to do with what never arrived to challenge it. When the island split from mainland Africa some 88 million years ago, it didn't just isolate the animals already aboard, it also sealed the door against everything that might have colonized later. The large predator lineages that came to dominate continental ecosystems, big cats, wolves, bears, simply never made the crossing in numbers capable of establishing themselves. Madagascar's isolation, so often the source of its strangest creatures, was also the reason its ecosystems developed an empty seat at the top of the food chain, and nature, presented with a vacancy, filled it with whatever was already on hand, that same mongoose-like ancestor, expanding into a role nothing else was there to contest. This is where island biogeography adds a second, quieter twist to the story. Islands don't just remove competition, they also cap resources. A landmass the size of Madagascar can only support so much biomass, which places a ceiling on how large any predator population can grow, no matter how uncontested its position. This is why the fossa, despite ruling its ecosystem more completely than a lion rules the savanna, remains smaller-bodied than most continental apex predators. It never needed to outmuscle a rival species, so raw size was never the currency evolution rewarded. Behavioral dominance, precision, and adaptability were. The result is an apex predator shaped by absence as much as by presence, defined not only by what it had to become to catch its prey, but by what it never had to become, because nothing was ever there to fight it for the position. For millions of years, this arrangement held. The fossa answered only to its prey, its terrain, and the slow clockwork of coevolution with the lemurs it hunted. No rival species, no contested carcasses, no pressure from another predator questioning its place at the top. That kind of uncontested reign has a hidden vulnerability, though, one that has nothing to do with competition and everything to do with complacency. An apex predator that has never needed to defend its position against another species has also never developed defenses against one. And for the first time in the fossa's evolutionary history, something has arrived on this island capable of challenging it after all. It doesn't hunt like a fossa. It doesn't compete for lemurs. It doesn't even belong to the same forest floor the fossa was built to dominate. And it may be the first real threat this animal has ever faced. Even after science had settled the fossa's ancestry, mapped its anatomy, and decoded the mechanics of its hunt, the animal still had one secret left, and it was, in some ways, the strangest of all. For years, researchers trying to study fossa reproduction ran into the same frustration. The behavior seemed to happen everywhere and nowhere. Then field biologists tracking radio-collared fossas found something that looked less like courtship and more like a stakeout. Female fossas, it turned out, returned to the same specific tree, the same particular branch, year after year, not a random clearing, not wherever convenience allows, but one chosen site, held almost like an appointment, and the males know it. They begin arriving days in advance, gathering below and around that branch, waiting, watching each other as much as they watch her, in a slow-building tension that can stretch on for close to a week before mating even begins. It's an arrangement that inverts the usual expectation of a solitary, elusive predator. This is an animal that hunts alone, moves alone, marks vast individual territories, and yet, for this one ritual, tolerates a crowd of rivals in close proximity, all drawn to a location the female alone decides. Why she chooses that particular branch, and why it stays consistent across seasons, remains one of the fossa's more stubborn, unanswered questions. Stranger still is what happens before any of this begins. Juvenile female fossas go through a temporary phase of masculinization, developing an enlarged, spine-covered clitoris that closely resembles a male's, before losing the feature entirely as they mature. Researchers suspect this bizarre biological detour serves a protective purpose. Young females who superficially resemble males may draw less aggression and less unwanted attention from adult males in a solitary species where encounters between strangers can turn dangerous fast. It's a strange, elegant possibility, a body temporarily disguising itself for safety, in a species with no other clear mechanism for protecting its young. Taken together with everything that came before, the mistaken ancestry, the impossible ankles, the arms race written into the canopy, the silent efficiency of the kill, this final piece completes a portrait of an animal that never once took the conventional evolutionary path. At every stage, where other predators found one solution, the fossa found its own, stranger one. And that pattern, repeated so many times across so many aspects of its biology, starts to look less like coincidence and more like a signature, the unmistakable fingerprint of an ecosystem that had to build everything from first principles, with no one to copy and no rules but the ones that worked. Return to where this story began, the frightened farmer, the empty henhouse, the whispered warnings about something that steals souls in the dark, and the fossa looks entirely different now than it did at the start. Not because the fear was foolish, but because it was aimed at the wrong target. There was never a demon in these forests. There was only precision so complete it looked supernatural to anyone standing outside the science. Every piece of this animal, once impossible to explain, now reads as a single coherent answer to a single, unrelenting question. How do you become the only apex predator an entire island will ever produce? A mongoose ancestor's body, reshaped until it converged on a cat's silhouette. An ankle borrowed, in function if not origin, from primates that share its canopy. A hunting strategy built not on power, but on reading terrain more precisely than its prey can predict it. A reproductive ritual so specific it required its own protective disguise for the young. None of this was destiny. It was millions of years of trial and error, running in a laboratory, with no other competitors allowed inside. And the FOSSA is what emerged when that experiment finally stopped needing to change. That, though, is precisely why it is now in trouble. An ecosystem calibrated this finely doesn't tolerate sudden disruption well, and Madagascar's forests are being disrupted faster than most ecosystems on Earth. Deforestation is not simply shrinking the fossa's hunting ground, it is severing the specific canopy corridors its entire body was engineered to exploit: the ankle rotation, the counterweight tail, the semi-retractable claws, all of it built for continuous forest that no longer exists in the same unbroken form. And into the fragments left behind have come feral dogs and cats, animals the fossa never evolved defenses against, carrying diseases its immune system has no evolutionary memory of, competing for a niche it has never had to defend from an outside species before. An apex predator that spent millions of years needing no rivals has, in the span of a few human generations, acquired several, and arrived at that moment with none of the adaptations competition usually forces a species to develop early. So the fossa's story ends not as a monster's tale, but as something closer to a warning quietly folded into a marvel. This was never a creature to fear in Madagascar's dark. It was one of evolution's most exact answers to an impossibly specific problem. And if it disappears, the loss won't be a single strange animal crossed off a list. It will be the unraveling of the only relationship of its kind on Earth. One island, one predator, and millions of years of lemurs and fossas shaping each other into the exact forms they became. What replaces that balance, once it's gone, is a question no one wants Madagascar's forests to have to answer.